No Amazon deliveries. Okay, we are now good. We are back online.
We are
So
back.
restart. Yeah.
Okay, so I will restart. We had a little tech. We love Monday technology is always a lot of fun. But it looks like we're back. Sean, you just give me a wave if there's any. Sean has been wonderful at helping us with all of the tech. So thank you, Sean. So yeah, welcome to everybody who's joining us live and thank you for joining. And for those who are watching the replay, great to have you as well. So we're here to have a conversation about AI governance, and we're calling it the AI Governance Gauntlet. And as I was saying before, we had a little technical glitch. Sean Terry and I have been having these conversations now for the past few months, as colleagues and friends, and just exploring this topic and thinking through things together, just having these discussions about what does AI look like, AI governance, what are some risks and ways to mitigate those risks for small and medium-sized businesses. And we've had two previous LinkedIn Live sessions. So if you have not seen those, we invite you to do so as well. Similar themes, but different discussions, and we explore some different topics. So if you just can't get enough of us, please go take a look at those. But today we're talking about the theme came from a conversation we had about, okay, so companies are starting to do AI governance, they're implementing these AI tools, using them. And now if we're on this journey, there are some potential hiccups as we had, but I think that's a good theme. Hiccups or unexpected things that might be coming up on this journey of using AI tools. The AI tools themselves are evolving, your organization is evolving, the rules, requirements, regulations are evolving within this constantly shifting space. What are some things to be thinking about as we run through this gauntlet, right? So that's the theme for today, and we'll just kind of have an exploration. We like to, kind of keep things flowing. So we'll see where our discussion takes us, but excited to have you all here. We'll do quick intros and then we'll dive in. I'm Jackie Wilkos. I'm founder of Enlightened Privacy PC. We are a boutique data protection, data governance law practice, working with, small and medium sized, but also some large businesses to help with data protection, compliance globally, as well as obviously data governance these days and AI governance. So that's me. I'll hand it over. Sean, you want to dive in?
Absolutely. I'm Sean McClain. I'm the founder of Low High Advisors. I'm a fractional CIO, and we offer multiple strategic fractional roles as well as back office implementation, really all things around technology, accounting, finance. You can come to us. In particular, we are really focused on helping companies along their AI path. This is a big topic around governance, so I'm excited to dig in. Kick it over to Terry.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Jackie. My name is Terry Zimniak. My whole career I've been in cybersecurity. So I worked as a fractional chief information security officer, which is CISO, fractional CISO, working for small, mid-sized companies as a fractional executive. So helping them understand how security have to be, how do we get there, and then making sure we get there. That's the role that I play.
Love it. Thank you both. And I threatened to ask each of you for an AI governance anecdote. So I won't push the issue, but if there's any fun AI governance anecdote either of you would like to share, I open the floor.
I'm not sure it's fun, but I did read today that the FDA had an announcement that they're starting to use generative AI. So with all of the clinical trial paperwork that they have to process, using generative AI in the space of comparisons and analytics and commenting within these large documents that they're getting. And I did a LinkedIn posting earlier today. Kudos to the FDA, one for getting started. So it's a
Mm.
nice concept of a quick win, a low risk area where the big organization FDA can start playing with generative AI. They can work through their governance issues. They can kind of figure out where they need to go. Secondly, glad that they made this announcement because I know a lot of companies are hesitant to go into generative AI and start using the AI tools. This is a good indication that big companies, risk averse companies like the FDA, are starting to play with this. It can be done. It can be done securely. take your time, set your structures in place, do your governance. It can be done, and it can be done well, and companies can get a lot of value out of this. So kudos to the FDA for starting and announcing this as well.
Yeah, and being in government related industries like many small businesses and nonprofits particularly are, that is really good news because there's so much inefficiencies in the overall governance interchange going on right now. I'll add in that specifically since we're talking about small businesses, which is my sweet spot. Again, I love to help those growing 10 to 200 type person businesses and effectively use their money, their investments properly, and governance is probably one of the least invested areas in a lot of small businesses. Number one, a lot of them feel that they're not required to do it. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And number two, they always tend to have somebody in their network or their spouse or somebody who works in enterprise, and they'll say, well, my company uses this really great program, and maybe it's like, One Trust or something comparable, and they don't think about not only the cost of ownership of these types of software platforms, but they also don't think about the overall time and capacity needed to make a governance, especially an enterprise focused governance program work. So I've had a couple clients in that regard who are like, well, yeah, my wife works at Google. They use this, we should be using this. And they're like a, 50-person law firm or something like that. It's like you have to do a step back a lot of times and start to understand that with these types of platforms, it's not comparable to using the same Google Suite for email or Microsoft 365 for SharePoint or document management as the big companies use. There's a specific scaling to governance, and they call them GRC platforms. We'll talk more about this today, but that's one of the big fun things I get to do with a lot of these companies to say, hey, let's walk before we run. And before you talk about investing, six figures in some of these platforms, sometimes seven figures. Let's start with something that might be a little bit more what we call like the low code, no code area. Even some of the open source options out there are really valuable. And still some companies say, well, if I'm making an investment in security and compliance and governance, shouldn't I go, full in? Like I want to do this. I have budget, I have awareness, but then they start looking at the actual granularity of the budget, and they might say, well, I'd planned to do a $40,000 spend, and that includes all this other stuff. And then all of a sudden they look at what the pricing is for some of these enterprise platforms. I'm like, that doesn't even cover a month sometimes of what these things cost. And plus you have to have the consulting and everything else to get it all stood up. So the usual long and short of these types of governance discussions is that it can seem daunting for small businesses, not only because of what needs to be done, but also the cost. So let's right size it. Let's make sure we do start small, and it's okay to do that. It's really okay to begin with a much, much smaller platform. And we'll talk about what those options are today too. How about you, Jack? You have anything that has been kind of interesting when you're helping the governance journey?
Yeah, it's funny. Well, I actually recently was speaking about my own governance journey, having my own law practice and thinking about, law firms, small law practices, and how do they leverage AI? And, we have to be thinking about our ethical obligations as well. And so that concept, and I think you mentioned it's seeming very daunting and sort of overwhelming to even, how do I even think about this? Especially if you're in a regulated space. And I know in our previous session, we talked about fintech, for example, but thinking about even an attorney's or an accountant's ethical obligations, and how do we thread that needle while also using AI to create efficiencies to help us, maximize the value that we bring to our clients, but in a way that's, ethically responsible. So I
Mm.
think living that, and sharing that experience with other attorneys in the field who are out exploring some of these tools right now and trying to navigate the ethical obligations, and how do you set up a governance framework for yourself, for your business that accounts for all of that, I think is important. And one other thing I will add is, Sean, you kind of touched on GRC platforms. And I think there's sort of this, myth or misnomer out there. I've heard it called the check the box compliance,
Mhm.
that you just deploy this tool and automatically compliance is done.
Right.
And that is not the case. It looks very nice, but it can, kind of be this balloon. You press on it and pff, it just deflates because there's nothing substantive within. So to your point, Sean, companies need to be thinking about, well, what are we actually governing here?
Hmm.
What, you have to have something to actually build a framework upon, or something to substantiate the framework that you're building. It has to be living and breathing, and I think we've talked about that before. So the concept of just, boop, press the button, check the box, I'm compliant now. Um, Not quite so easy. Wish it was, especially for small businesses, who have a lot going on. So, yeah, that is sort of my own story, but also, I think the story of a lot of small and medium-sized businesses as well. And even large businesses. I think there are large companies out there who are still trying to figure out, how do we scale a governance framework? It's sort of the same deal, the press the button, check the box, and we're done. I think sometimes larger companies have even more of a mythical idea that they're, compliant when they just pay a lot of money for these tools. And that may not necessarily be the case, which
Hmm.
leads
I
us into
like,
our conversation. Terry,
if I could
sorry, I
add
saw
one
you.
point,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'd love to add that I always use the word program when I talk about governance. So to your point, it is living and breathing, and that's okay. It needs to be maintained. You've got to
Yeah.
grow it. So nothing one it. Just like your ethics is going to be a program, and cybersecurity is these are living, breathing things within your organization, whether
Yeah.
it's a giant international corporation or a small one. The culture, what do the people do, the mission, programs, these things are all kind of living entities necessary to make your company to thrive. So you're right, nothing's set and forget. You got to look at it, because as we talk today, there's a lot of evolution external to your organization, changes internal to your organization. These pieces have to fit together, and you have to tweak your governance program to make it work correctly.
I love that. Thank you. And I think, Terry, you're coming at it from the security perspective. And I think a lot of companies have, gotten very familiar with, and okay, we know security is sort of important. We have to protect stuff. So we'll have the security program. But like, why do we need all this other governance? Is this on top of? What do we? So that segues us into what we're going to talk about. And so we have a little use case here that we were going to set up to just kind of set a framework for our framework discussion, or discussion about frameworks. So we'll throw that out there quickly, and this is sort of our, kind of guidepost as we go along the conversation. We might refer back to this kind of use case setup to guide our conversation. So briefly, we're going to be looking at a fictional company we're calling HealthQuest Inc., otherwise known as HQ. And this company, it's a small business. They've deployed several AI tools at this point to help build their efficiencies, like we're talking about. And they've deployed Copilot, they've deployed an AI note taker app, as well as enterprise ChatGPT through OpenAI. And they, as their name suggests, HealthQuest, they process some sensitive health information. We're going to say that part of the data is covered under HIPAA, and part of it may not actually be HIPAA data, but it may be health data still under some other non-HIPAA laws. And then we're saying HQ, they're doing their thing, right? They're trying to do the right job. They've deployed an acceptable use policy for AI, so they've got that in place. They wanted it to be pretty streamlined, so it's a one pager. It's easy accessible, right? So they've got their one pager AI acceptable use policy, and they're, slowly trying to implement some governance elements to their governance program. But they're going slow, and they're a little overwhelmed by it and not really sure what else they need to put into place. They have done a little bit of training, but that's where they're at right now. So that's our HQ, our fictional company. So we're here to talk about what are some things that HQ should be thinking about and looking for. So we're setting that up in the background so we can return to that concept as we go. So starting out initially, we have already said a lot about AI governance, but let's just hit pause, back up a little bit. What do we actually mean when we say AI governance? And I think, Terry, you mentioned the security, like we kind of know what security governance looks like. We've heard of ISO, things like that. But so is AI governance that? What is AI governance? And I don't mean to be facetious. I think, a lot of us
Yeah.
have some concept, but let's just touch base and align because it seems like a lot of us can be speaking across each other at different levels and not really connecting up when in terms of what we're actually meaning when we're talking about AI governance. And there are a lot of different concepts of what AI governance is, should be, looks like. So in our own words, Terry, maybe we'll start with you. What actually is AI governance? And, we can kind of add on after that how that then connects up with other governance frameworks that we might be working with or familiar with.
Sure. So governance, generally speaking, is kind of the rules of the road in a certain area. So it parallels and works with GRC that Sean mentioned, your governance, risk, your policies, procedures, uh, who has authority to do things, which are strategic planning, which are risk considerations we spoke about. It's really all the rules in the space and how can you use this, whatever the function is, the governed function, how does this meet the organizational needs? Common governance efforts are cybersecurity governance, data governance, which we probably will talk about because AI and data go hand in hand. So that the governance in that space, organizational governance, your board of directors sorts of stuff. So it's really just the rules of the road in the space, but it consists of a lot of pieces. You've probably heard of independent, again, risk management. So if you were to start using a new AI tool, what are the rules about considering before you absorb it in? If you're going to build AI, how do you align this with your ethical requirements? Who makes the decision? All those sorts of decisions are bundled into your governance framework. The reason you have governance is governance kind of sets the rules of the road, and it's not meant to be a prescriptive, here's the 5,000 considerations in generative AI, but it sets the rules. And really, good governance makes the organization run faster. We have pre-approved channels, and you run along this channel as fast as you can, and good for you. If something's outside the channel, stop and have the conversation. So where that comes into play is risk management is under governance. And maybe you say, we understand what low risk AI is. AI that we use to listen to our Zoom calls and transcribe it. Low risk, we have a very low level of governance. Maybe we just inventory it. Maybe we have an owner and we track it, and we have certain use cases where you can store the data files, but then you're done. So that governance review of Zoom could be a 15-minute effort, and away you go. But if you're going to start using AI to do predictive this and that and HR sorts of stuff, or dealing with HIPAA data, you certainly have much longer road to go. So the outcome of governance is the set of rules and expectations and authority and approvals and kind of all the rules around that sort of topic. And that's what it is. The good news is a good governance structure is scalable. So if you already have your AI governance and your cybersecurity governance in place, you can parallel those processes for AI governance and data governance. So you're going to have a steering committee, you're going to have risk concepts, you're going to have reviews of the processes. So a foundational governance structure is scalable to these different concepts. So that's the good news. If you're already mature in one place, you can kind of mirror that for the secondary places as well.
Yeah, I'll quickly add on to Jackie that what Terry just described is an excellent foundation again for all governance, and the AI piece can, especially when we're doing like just overall tech stack evaluations, say it's an accounting platform or practice management, time and billing, code management type of system. All of those now have AI components inside of them. Almost every tech developer, producer, distributor is incorporating AI components. And so having that foundation in parallel with your cybersecurity, your data, all those other governance programs is now critical to upgrade amongst your internal due diligence, your ongoing evaluation of your current stack because things change. And a lot of companies, especially small businesses, feel that they have like the job is done once they've done that initial due diligence and then they've just made their bed with certain vendors. So now a lot of owners feel like, well, the vendor that we use here for our legal practice management system, or in this case, our like biotech, maybe research platform or handling the code for distributing something through the web, we feel good already. We have done our due diligence and they feel like that part of their job is done. And if they don't have a governance platform on top of that, they really are missing the boat on that constant what we call in certain industries internal controls, internal audits part of governance, so that you do have to have that constant process, evaluation and then improvement, because as Terry mentioned, there can be a lot of bias and a lot of ethical differences that happen when things are moving. And as we talked about a little bit setting up this talk, some of those tools that Health Quest is using, like OpenAI, ChatGPT Enterprise, they have changed things heavily in the past couple weeks, and we expect those changes to continue to move forward. They have now introduced connectors to almost every major enterprise data source, including SharePoint, Google, et cetera. So you do have this whole new standard of how things are going and how that other risk management needs to be able to connect and then overlay of that connection. And that's something is new. So if you're the executive that was on top of this particular AI governance standard around, say, a chatbot connection to your SharePoint piece, and all of a sudden it just widely opens up a much more robust connection like OpenAI is doing, you do have to reevaluate that. And that's part of where governance really does reside. And we'll get a little bit deeper into that granular piece. But again, it's so important that you don't set and forget things. You have to continue to reevaluate it. And that's where the programming also is helping, because you can build workflows. A lot of us are going to forget about it. And so a good GRC program, even if it's just a base one that's locked into SharePoint, Notion, et cetera, whatever type of data management you have internally, you get the reminders, you get a approval set up so that it's going through some sort of self-auditing, self-check, go back into the systems, validate with the vendors, and then be able to move forward once everybody feels like, yeah, we can still use this as intended, even with the new changes. We just have to adjust our own training and protocols around how to use this. Or you make the decision like risk around management, because then they say, well, this risk has gone above our threshold. We either need to pause use of this until we reevaluate, put it back in a sandbox mode, or talk about actually terminating the use of this completely because the risk is too high. So it's a constant, ever-changing piece that companies, unfortunately, right now in governance feel like it's just part of the ride and they go for it for the most part. And you're not really putting that governance first and foremost. And it's tough because if you don't have a role or department that is taking ownership over it, the capacity can be the biggest problem.
That's a really good point. Capacity. Yeah, thank you. Thanks you both. So I think what I'm hearing is governance is generally a set of rules of the road to guide us on what we're doing with these tools or what we want to be doing and how these tools can help us, but in a responsible way, building in the ethics principles. And on top of it, it's evolving with us. It's ideally embedded and built within the framework of our organization and how we govern other elements of our organization and our data life cycle. So I think that's a good summary. I'd just like to add that there are a lot of different sort of guidelines and governance or sample governance frameworks out there. That in itself can be a bit overwhelming, I think. You've got the NIST, um, And then there are some, I always think back to the OECD AI principles. And so I think at the core of a governance framework, there are some baseline principles such as transparency, fairness, like non-discrimination, things like that that are sort of core and fundamental to any governance framework. Particularly, I think of the data governance framework, and that those principles sort of flow across different areas that you would be governing. For example, data protection, privacy, you've got data security. They all kind of rely on these same foundational principles if you really think about it. So data governance also rests on similar foundational principles of transparency and fairness. Um, and then, accountability. And so you can kind of build on top of what you already have if you already have a framework that's built around these principles. And I think of data protection is one area where, they kind of flow together very nicely. And so you build these rules, you build in your ethical guidelines. I think, at the core of a governance program, you do have, as we talked about, your policies and procedures, right? How should things work? And I think, Sean, you mentioned nicely, you can fuse that into what you're currently using within your organization, whether it's Notion or whatever other sort of program elements that just, you work with day in and day out. That's easy. That makes this easy and accessible for your team, however your team operates, and that will get you to a place where, you're living and breathing governance. So while there are these, frameworks out there as samples, I think boiling it down can be helpful. And so I think HQ has its acceptable use policy, which is great. It has a little bit of training, and it sounds like some more formal pieces could be put in place, but we'd have to look at what HQ is doing, in terms of, is it using Notion, or what kind of tools is it using behind the scenes? Does it have sort of a third party vendor, platform that it's using? Can we leverage that, for example, as part of our governance framework? So something to be thinking about. But one thing we saw in the news that I'd like to throw out there for everybody is the bill that's floating in Congress right now, the big, beautiful bill, and the 10-year ban on states passing AI legislation, AI regulation. Curious, so what if HQ just says, well, why am I going to bother with this? There's no regulation on AI. So if I start doing all this fancy governance stuff, what's the point? It's not regulated. So I'm just going to go run free and use this and just max out all the value I can. And governance is going to get in the way and take up time and effort. Why bother? What if HQ comes to us and says do we have any thoughts around that at this point?
I would start with a statement that regulation is not your only AI risk. You've got all sorts of AI risks. You've got data loss, you've got contractual obligations, you've got state laws maybe in place, you may have laws protecting the data themselves that may be AI agnostic. Whether AI or not, you must protect the data. There's laws out to that effect. So yeah, the regulations are coming and they're dynamic and they're surely going to change. Your framework and your governance structure should be set such that you can adjust and tweak to the coming regulations. Maybe part of your governance actually says our law group is responsible to look for the regulations. Accountability should be built in your governance. So your governance structure should make sure you look for the changes and account for the changes, but that is not your only risk. So you want to protect your organization from all these broader issues beyond just regulations, and that's what governance will give you.
And if the broader industry that you're marketing to, so if HQ is starting off with selling to other small businesses that maybe don't have that same regulation asset forcing them to say we got to follow to a T these regulations because it is, not as it's not a material issue for us as a small business. That tends to be the case. And then all of a sudden, You might get a real big client that walks in the door, and they might be in Europe, they might be in other types of,
Right.
parts of the world or the country, or they're just large enough that they have self-imposed their own specific internal regs that say we are going to need to only work with vendors that can do X, Y, Z and show it to us, and have potentially third parties that are
Mhm.
also auditing and proofing this out. And that's the whole SOC 2 HIPAA certification journey that a lot of biotech companies have to go through. So it's one of those chicken or the egg approaches for some business owners where they might say, well, we'll get there when we have to. But the problem is when you get there and it's potentially a huge deal and you need to have those things in place to actually secure the deal, as you said earlier, Jackie, you can't just snap your fingers and get those types of compliance or governance systems ready to roll to
Right.
showcase it. So having the governance program in a way that you can scale up and then walk,
Right.
then run, a lot of them are going to help get you ready for SOC 2 auditing or HIPAA auditing so that you can get certified and have that report that you can easily hand to the company and say, boom, here you go. But as most of us know, and a lot of tech business owners know this, it can take 18 to 36 months
Yeah.
to do your SOC 2 Type 2 journey with a lot of investment and a lot of back and forth. So you really do need to think about all the regs, especially if something like this happened. And then that also stipulates that these bills are going to get passed through the Senate. And as we've probably heard, there's a lot of wishy-washy going on right now with the current administration. So this could happen for the next 4 years. They could throw in a federal reg proposal into some other random bill, walk it back, go back and forth. And if you're a business owner, you almost have to move forward with your own specifications, your own investments, without thinking about that type of dependency upon regs. Most of them do, in my opinion, focus more on their client regs. And so that's the case of like,
Yeah.
particularly if you're working with anybody in Europe, they're imposing some of the deepest regs right now in the world on AI. So if you're going to play within that framework, you should target investing as much as you can seem possible to make sure that you're going to hit your client requirements.
Thank you both. Love that. Yeah. And just to reiterate that theme one more time, that, yeah, there's a lot more beyond just AI specific regulation. You have all of the various other laws. And I like both of you have brought up your obligations with respect to your customers or your clients, ethical obligations. And I think we're talking about HQ here specifically, health data. And so you have to be thinking about, well, we still have HIPAA compliance obligations potentially, and or, other health data law obligations. What
Mhm.
does that look like? That's still going to impact everything we do with the data, including the use of AI tools. That's not sort of excluded. We already have laws being passed in the states that exist and are going into effect. And we have Europe and we have, yeah, the EU AI Act is now going into effect on this rolling basis. And, even if you're not directly impacted, your potential customers, clients are, or likely could be. And so paying attention to that is a very important issue. And I think beyond that, yeah, Sean, to your point, this could be going on for years. Meanwhile, regulation is still happening.
Mhm.
Um, legislation is being developed and passed in various states, and the states are also objecting to what's going on in this bill. So we'll see if this actually comes through, or if it's just a bit of grandstanding here. But it is making us all think and reevaluate. And I think this is a good place to spotlight that there are a lot of other considerations that necessitate solid governance around AI beyond just, well, there's this law out there that says specifically when I'm using an AI tool, a Gen AI tool, I have to do XYZ. You
Mhm.
may already have to be having to do X, Y, Z, regardless with respect to your other obligations. So love that. Thank you. So moving on. So okay, HQ is moving on, doing its thing. And now we're thinking about governance in action. And I think all of us have alluded to some of the sneaky things that can come up. And I'm intentionally being a bit broad here to open the space so we can dive into the specifics. But the ongoing risks. So, okay, we've got some baseline governance. Our organization is now using various AI tools, but what are some of the risks, potential pitfalls, unexpected things? Expect the unexpected here, I think is a, good cliche theme to have. What are some of these potentially unexpected issues, risks that we need to be looking out for and prepare to mitigate, prepare to address? And how should we do that with respect to HQ or any organization, but HQ specifically here? So anybody want to take that first?
Go ahead, Terry.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I'll go first.
Great.
I think you need to realize that again, your business is an entity and it's in a dynamic environment. So what you have to be aware of is that your use cases are going to change, your users are going to change, your data is going to change, and then externally, your clients and your vendors and their regulations are changed. So that unexpected component really is just the dynamics of the way any business operates. It's all healthy. It's meant to be there. It's a good sign your organization's changing and growing. But some of the unknowns are, or you got to be aware these things are going to evolve. And again, we talked about compliance as a program, governance as a program. That's part of the evolution of the program. You got to keep checking on these things and making sure they're all properly in sync. As far as other risks, I've done a lot of control mapping in the AI space, and a lot of it, frankly, maps very well to what the cyber folks are already doing. So the backups and the viruses control and the change control and the vulnerability scanning, that's all already typically in a cyber program, but there's a lot of specific risks that are really AI unique. So we found things like user training. Any good AI framework is going to talk about make sure your users know what's going on. You mentioned the NIST AI risk management framework, Jackie, a very popular one and a great place to get started if you're just putting your toe into AI risk and governance, a good document to read. But a lot of it talks about people. Educate the leaders, educate the staff, talk about culture, how you going to, talk to people what they can and can't do. Acceptable use agreement is a good start. It's one of the things you have to deal with, but the user part of AI is a very unique risk that these frameworks, some of the benefits of the frameworks will walk you through issues like that.
Yeah, that's a big point. And any real true GRC program should have an inventory component that does look very similar to a cybersecurity program. But the big difference is this rate of innovation, this rate of change is like blowing past most classic technology vendors. You'll see even some of the larger vendors not release these types of updates, not even sometimes quarterly, that are this big. They'll have little patches and feature releases. Microsoft has their update patch Tuesday type of thing that happens weekly. But for some of these vendors, Google, OpenAI, etc., they will have a new huge release of different versions of programs weekly, sometimes multiple times a week, where it is extremely difficult, even as just a pure user of the systems, to actually understand like what is actually going on and what are the risks, what are the costs, what actually are the best practices to stay on top of all of these things. So for small businesses in particular, it is really problematic to actually keep that inventory up to date and be able to understand what should be used and what should be happening associated with those risks. But it's really important that you do focus on at least two things. And again, a lot of acceptable use policies will point at your GRC inventory of your applications that are approved to use, as well as the data repositories and the data definitions. They'll call that also a data dictionary. you need to make sure that all of those flows are mapped, especially when they're going in and out of different data repositories, so that that is truly understood. And I mentioned this back in session one of this series. There's a new protocol called MCP. It's Model Context Protocol, Modal Context Protocol. And now, even since then, there's all these other layers that help agentic platforms talk to each other called the A2A, agent to agent protocol. So now we're at a state, just 2 months later, where MCP is allowing this interoperability between platforms to talk to each other, but also pipe in governance, data security, data loss prevention, protection oversight platforms. That is a real critical aspect that, again, is new. And most small businesses, they could turn to their IT vendor, their internal team, and a lot of people are going to still come back and say, I don't know what that is. I don't know how to do that. Why is this important to me? Again, if we're not looking at regs to force what's right, we have to look at our internal teams and internal vendors. So that goes back to Terry's point he just made on heavy education, not only on the systems, but on the actual pipelines between these systems, like an MCP, to be able to make sure that we do have this oversight in place. And again, these are new things this year that a lot of companies have never thought about. They just said, well, is there an API that I can connect these two systems so that I have data interoperability? Great. That's all I need. I don't care about the security so much. But again, just a reminder, an API key is basically just a long password. And if that long password is cracked, somebody can get into either one or both of those databases. That's a big problem, especially when we're talking about data privacy and protecting against data leaks. MCP can give much more oversight and protection that just one API key doesn't give. So there's a lot of reasoning behind putting those things into your inventory and then managing them. That's so critical as we move forward around governance, because again, the really public examples, particularly for a company like HQ, is that they might have a dev team who is using GitHub Copilot, and then all of a sudden they also start using a vibe coding platform to maybe go on the side and say, oh, I want to do this. And, client is asking for this feature. So I'm going to test it out in a purely open source platform and then bring it back into GitHub. But as we all know, some folks can get a little confused. Did I put it in the right one? Is this approved? And then all of a sudden your proprietary code has now been leaked. And again, that might not be direct code related to interaction, but it could be something that a hacker could use to drill back in. So it's a big issue, that inventory and then training to that inventory of approved platforms needs to do. And that change log is something that really should be part of that foundation for GRC.
Thank you. Thanks, both of you. And I think just to add a little bit to that and just paying attention, want to make sure we're wrapping on time, so I won't go too long. But the concept I think both of you touched on is in a way, and I think we've heard this in a lot of different ways, but I've seen this time and time again in just the organizations that I've been working with my clients. It's using AI tools, this artificial intelligence is reinforcing the importance of the human, reinforcing the importance of communication among human players who are utilizing these tools. And not to, boil it down to these basic fluffy concepts, but it's really true. Sean, you're talking about, keeping the inventory up to date. That requires communication among teams, among team players to make sure that that's happening. But also some of these unforeseen risks that we're seeing. I was hearing a story of, OpenAI rolled out a new alpha agreement, and there were very few protections in that agreement, and it was fundamentally not the same as the enterprise agreement that they had this company had previously signed that had protections. They reviewed it. It was part of their third-party risk management process, and then this alpha agreement just showed up. And I think that demonstrates a perfect risk of all of a sudden you think, oh, well, we already signed with them. It's fine. Woof, off we go because we want to use the new, most important, sparkly, shiny thing, when in fact, that completely gutted any protections you had in your enterprise agreement. So the importance of looking at that and then having the conversation like, whoa, hold up, what is this? Are we reviewing it? And it's also the importance of making sure you're, continuing ongoing governance of reviewing new contract elements, new addendum, new features, new functionalities that are coming through. Is this really the same as what we signed up for before, or is it fundamentally different, and in what ways? And is it introducing new risks that we hadn't looked at before? And I think seeing these new features coming out at rapid fire, new contracts, obviously, coming from existing established vendors that you're using for new features that don't have the same level of protections. They're trying to, use the data to train the model. But if our position is no, we're not allowing our AI vendors to use our company data to train their models, well, now we're at odds. And if we just go forward and sign something, we're creating holes in our data governance that we weren't aware. And this is especially risky when we're dealing with things like health data or highly regulated data, personal data. So being on the lookout so we can catch some of these things as new risks as they come through and show up, and being ready to evolve and pivot as needed, and paying attention. I think, Sean, you mentioned, kind of the shadow AI, employees using AI sort of on the side and then taking proprietary data sets, code, and putting it into these unapproved AI tools. That comes back to what Terry was saying, the importance of education, but just also communication within the organization of, hey, this is, these are the rules, but this is why it's important, this is why it matters, and here, let's join together to make sure we're actually making this a priority and making this happen in terms of protecting the data that's very important to us, is critical, and keeps us going. And so that I think is a critical element as well. So we're nearing time. Do we have any questions, or should we talk briefly to close for maybe 5 minutes about what accountability looks like?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Yeah, no questions have come in
Okay.
through the live quite yet. But again, for anybody watching, go ahead and use the chat. We can answer after the live is finished as well. So, yeah,
Yeah,
Terry, do you
yeah,
have any
definitely reach out.
closing thoughts on accountability or next steps for an HQ or small business that are looking to get this going?
Well, I would say generally that the reminder that businesses out there, governance, it doesn't have to be massive. It could be right sized to your organization. So I've done projects for really large financial organizations, and I've drafted very large governance programs, which reference dozens and scores of policies, procedures, and we from there pull dozens of controls. So you can have a really complex governance program if it's necessary for your business. Smaller businesses don't need that. Now, the concepts are the same. You must have accountability. We spoke about who's responsible for what. General policy statements have to be in there. Risk management must certainly be in there. How you maintaining regulatory compliance must be in there. How you maintaining the program. We talked about governance being a living entity. You gotta maintain it. You gotta grow. You gotta look for changes that impact governance. So you have to do governance, but just like most other things you're going to do in your business, make sure it's right sized. You can get the value of governance without having a giant 100-page document that articulates all this. And lastly, accountability. Accountability is built into your policies and built into your governance program as well. It's absolutely critical. So when we talk about the change to Copilot, a very common problem, companies using Copilot, and then new AI functions get turned on automatically. Who's responsible for finding those sorts of things?
Yeah.
So your governance and your policy will say that whoever the owner of the application is responsible for looking for this. Maybe that person does a risk assessment as articulated in governance, And if the risk hits a certain threshold, you must have this conversation. What needs to get done, who does it, on what frequency. That's how the accountability structure works, because if there's no accountability, it may not get done.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just quickly add on that the best way to start a governance program, if you haven't already, and again, this is a safe space, it's okay if your business has not started this officially, is to, number one, engage with an external expert like anybody on this call or anybody in your network that has experience doing this type of stuff for help. But number two, internally talk to your team, see what they're using already. And a lot of times, even if you have the acceptable use policy like HQ, people are still going outside of that just because they have these other personal preferences or other things that they like to use. So talk to them about it, because that's part of the governance process, is bringing these into the actual acceptable and managed programs and communicating to your team how important it is to talk about that and not just keep it siloed to themselves, because a good governance program is going to help bring new use cases and new tools into the company. So start having those internal either surveys, team meetings, discussions, and try to make it a safe spot, because that's really what governance is going to do. It's going to help you manage that change rather than just set it and forget it. Jackie, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you. I think really good points. Again, back to the communication piece, and I like the concept of, hey, this is, a safe space. We're all in this together in terms of the governance. And I think one area too, Terry, you mentioned a really important point of who's monitoring this, who's actually watching, who's doing the job. I think that comes back to communication as well, and also just a sense of clear delineation of responsibilities across the organization, but maybe coming together, different committees, or not to create committees, but maybe we build it into already existing frameworks. And we kind of talked about that previously. So I always think of, in the data governance framework, we've got existing sort of pathways that have already been built. To the extent you can leverage those if they're working well, and maybe tweak them a little bit so that they are either expanded or refined, so that we're addressing the AI, new AI features, or expansion of using company data as inputs into different models, for example, or different systems. I think that's important to be thinking about. And then also, monitoring the outputs, looking for, who's looking at what's coming out of these models, thinking about bias, thinking about hallucinations, but also just, and I'm coming at it more from the ethical, health data world, paying attention to what we're getting back as well as what we're putting in. And that comes back again to who's doing this and how are we communicating this in a way where we're all leveling up and evolving in a more positive way that's taking the efficiencies and really using it for the best value for our organization and for our customers or our clients. And yeah, and having conversations, Sean, to your point, with your trusted advisors in the field is important as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yep.
great. All right. Well, anything to close? Thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And reach out with any questions. I don't think we have any here, but don't be shy if you have questions about this or just want to continue the conversation. Big theme of communication. So feel free to reach out. We're here to have the conversation with you and continue on, because this continually gets more interesting as the AI systems evolve, AI models evolve, and the uses and applications evolve as well. So this is a continual learning world that we are in, and it's expanding and exponentially and more rapidly. So it's important for all of us to stay connected.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for watching,
Yeah.
everybody, now or after the fact. And you will see all of our LinkedIn accounts that you can reach out for those questions attached to this talk. So thanks so much, everybody.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.